Have you ever felt that strange sensation of observing your own life from the outside, as if you were a spectator of your own existence? As if every daily gesture, every conversation, every moment that should be natural and automatic suddenly became artificial, loaded with an inexplicable weight. You wake up in the morning and realize that even the act of brushing your teeth has become too conscious, too mechanical, too strange. Albert Camus knew exactly what I'm talking about when he wrote about the absurd nature of the human condition. Today we're going to explore together how excessive thinking not only distances us from normalcy, but actually reveals a profound truth about the artificial nature of that very normalcy we seek so hard to preserve. Imagine for a moment that you're walking down a street you've traveled for years, perhaps decades. Suddenly, for no apparent reason, you stop and look around. People pass by you with inexplicable haste, each carrying their invisible burdens, their private concerns, their unquestioned certainties. And in that moment you ask yourself, where are all these people going with such certainty? What moves them with such conviction? Why should I be moving too? This is the experience of philosophical awakening that Camus describes so masterfully in his writings. It's the moment when life loses its comforting transparency and becomes opaque, questionable, absurd in the deepest sense of the word. Excessive thinking doesn't destroy normalcy. It simply removes the veil that prevented us from seeing that normalcy was never as natural as we believed. When we begin to overthink our existence, the rituals that compose our days, the social conventions we follow without question, we discover something disturbing. Most of what we consider normal is actually a fragile construction, maintained by the collective consensus of not thinking too much about it. Take as an example the experience of going to work every morning. For most people, this is an automatic, natural, necessary action. But when you begin to reflect deeply about it, when thinking becomes excessive, you perceive the strangeness of dedicating most of your waking hours, your most productive days, your most vigorous years, to an activity that perhaps has no connection whatsoever with who you really are or what you truly value. You realize you're playing a role that was written by others, in a play whose plot you never consciously chose. Camus teaches us that this awakening to the absurd is not a pathology or mental weakness. It is in fact a sign of intellectual honesty and existential courage. The person who thinks too much, who questions too much, who can no longer be content with ready-made answers and conventional explanations, is simply refusing to live in bad faith, as Sartre would say. They're refusing to accept that things are as they are simply because they've always been that way. But this refusal comes with a price: the loss of existential innocence, the impossibility of returning to the state of non-questioning that characterizes ordinary life. It's as if you had tasted a forbidden fruit that opened your eyes to aspects of reality you preferred not to see. Excessive thinking places us before questions for which there are no definitive, satisfactory, reassuring answers. Why do we exist? What is the purpose of human life? Why is suffering so universal? Why is death inevitable? Why do we become so attached to things we know are temporary? These questions, once awakened in the mind, cannot be easily silenced. They become constant companions, whispering doubts in moments that should be tranquil, questioning certainties in situations that should be comforting. Normalcy, which once functioned as a natural anesthetic against existential anguish, loses its effectiveness. Social rituals, cultural conventions, family traditions, all of this that once offered meaning and direction now appears as arbitrary constructions, useful perhaps but not necessarily true or meaningful. But here's a fascinating paradox that Camus explored deeply. The more we think about life, the more we question its apparent lack of meaning, the more intensely we can experience it. Consciousness of the absurd need not lead to despair or paralysis. It can, on the contrary, free us to create our own meanings, to choose our own directions, to live with an authenticity that doesn't depend on external approval or social conformity. When you accept that normalcy is a collective illusion, that the rules of the social game are arbitrary, that others' expectations about your life have no ultimate authority over your choices, something extraordinary happens. You become free in a way you never imagined possible. Think about how many important decisions you've made in life, based not on your own deep reflections, not on your own authentic passions and values, but simply on what was considered normal, expected, acceptable. How many opportunities for self-knowledge and self-creation have you lost because you were too busy trying to fit into prefabricated molds, following scripts written by previous generations who faced different challenges, in different contexts, with different possibilities? Excessive thinking, by destroying our sense of normalcy, also destroys these invisible limitations that prevented us from exploring unexplored existential territories, from experimenting with ways of living that are genuinely ours. The experience of thinking too much about existence is like waking up from a collective dream. Initially, there's disorientation, a feeling of no longer knowing your place in the world, as if the coordinates you always used to navigate through life had become obsolete overnight. You look around and see people continuing their routines with a naturalness that now seems impossible for you to recover. They wake up, have coffee, go to work, watch television, make weekend plans, discuss politics, complain about traffic, celebrate birthdays, as if all these activities were endowed with intrinsic meaning, as if human life had a clear and universally comprehensible direction. And you, who began to think too much, feel like a foreigner observing the customs of a civilization you no longer fully understand. But this feeling of estrangement, this loss of normalcy that excessive thinking provokes, is not a condemnation to unhappiness or isolation. It's an invitation to creation. Camus shows us that we can be like Sisyphus, condemned to push a stone up a mountain for all eternity, but still capable of finding joy and purpose in the very act of pushing the stone. The absence of a given, prefabricated, universally valid meaning for human existence doesn't mean life is empty or worthless. It means we are free and also responsible for creating our own values, our own meanings, our own directions. This freedom is simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, a burden and a gift. Let me ask something that might resonate deeply with your experience. Do you also sometimes feel as if you're playing a role you didn't choose? As if your life were a performance for an audience you don't know, following a script you never read completely? If you feel this, I want you to know you're not alone in this experience. Millions of people around the world go through this awakening to the absurd, this perception that much of what we consider normal is actually arbitrary. Leave a comment saying, "I feel this too," if you recognize yourself in this description. Your response is not only important for you, but can help other people feel less isolated in this journey of questioning. Sometimes, knowing that others also go through similar experiences is the first step in transforming existential anguish into fuel for a more authentic and creative life. Excessive thinking reveals to us that so-called normal life is sustained by a series of tacit agreements, unquestioned conventions, mental habits that were transmitted to us through education, culture, social pressure. We discover that much of what we always considered natural, inevitable, is actually contingent, optional, modifiable. This discovery can be initially destabilizing, but it's also profoundly liberating. If the rules of the game are not absolute, if the paths traced are not obligatory, if others' expectations have no ultimate authority over our lives, then we are much freer than we ever imagined to redesign our existence according to our own criteria, our own passions, our own carefully examined values. This freedom conquered through excessive thinking comes accompanied by a responsibility that many people prefer to avoid. It's more comfortable to follow ready-made recipes, maps drawn by others, than to assume the responsibility of creating our own path. It's more reassuring to believe there's a right way to live, universally valid, than to accept that each person needs to discover or invent their own right way to live. Excessive thinking takes us out of this existential comfort zone and places us before the necessity of making authentic choices, of assuming authorship of our lives in a more conscious and deliberate way. It's not an easy process, but it's a process that can lead to a form of satisfaction and fulfillment that doesn't depend on external approval or social conformity. Camus observed that revolt against the absurd of existence need not be destructive or nihilistic. It can be, on the contrary, profoundly life-affirming. When you stop seeking a ready-made, universally valid meaning for human existence and accept that it's you who must create meaning through your choices and actions, something remarkable happens. You become a creator instead of just a follower, an artist of your own life instead of just an interpreter of roles that others wrote for you. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and certainly doesn't happen without periods of confusion, doubt, anguish. But when it happens, when you finally embrace your existential freedom and the responsibility that comes with it, you discover a form of vitality you didn't know existed. Excessive thinking also teaches us something fundamental about the nature of human relationships. When you stop automatically following social scripts, when you begin to question the conventions that govern our interactions, you become capable of establishing more authentic connections with other people. You stop relating to the roles people play and begin relating to who they really are behind those roles. You stop expecting others to correspond to your expectations based on social norms and begin to appreciate the singularity, complexity, contradiction inherent in each human being. This change in perspective can transform not only how you see yourself, but how you see and relate to the world around you. It's important to recognize that not everyone is ready or willing to abandon the security of unquestioned normalcy. Many people find comfort, stability, identity, and social conventions in predefined roles, in collective expectations, and this isn't necessarily bad or mistaken. Each person has their own rhythm of development, their own needs, their own existential challenges. What Camus teaches us is not that we should despise those who choose to live in more conventional ways, but that we should honor our own journey of questioning and self-knowledge, even when it leads us to territories that others prefer not to explore. The solitude that sometimes accompanies excessive thinking is not necessarily negative solitude. It can be fertile, creative solitude, necessary for the process of self-discovery and self-creation. It's in the silence of deep questioning that we often find our most authentic voice. It's in the distance from external influences that we can finally hear our own desires, values, dreams, fears, without the interference of social noise that normally distracts us from ourselves. This solitude can become a valuable companion in the process of building a life that is truly ours, not just a variation of lives that others have already lived. Excessive thinking about existence also puts us in contact with our mortality in a way that normal life constantly tries to help us avoid. When you really think about the fact that your existence is temporary, that one day you won't be here anymore to make choices, experience sensations, create relationships, build projects, this fundamentally changes how you evaluate what's worth doing with the time you have available. Concerns that once seemed enormous can reveal themselves as trivial in the face of the perspective of finitude. Opportunities you once postponed indefinitely can suddenly seem urgent. The tendency to waste time with activities that don't bring real satisfaction can decrease drastically when you truly incorporate the consciousness that time is a limited and precious resource. If you've made it this far in this reflection, you've probably already experienced at least some of the feelings and insights we're exploring together. This means you're part of an invisible community of people who chose to face the deepest existential questions instead of simply avoiding them. If you value this kind of philosophical exploration, if you find meaning in these discussions about authenticity, freedom, existential responsibility, consider subscribing to this channel. Here we create a space for reflection and dialogue for people who aren't content with superficial answers, who seek to understand more deeply not only the world around them, but also the inner world of possibilities, questionings, and creations. Your participation in this community of thought is not only welcome, but genuinely valuable for all of us who are navigating these sometimes turbulent but always fascinating existential waters. The experience of losing the sense of normalcy through excessive thinking can be compared to the process of learning to walk again after an accident. Initially, each step requires conscious attention. Each movement needs to be planned and executed with care. The naturalness, the automaticity that once characterized walking is lost, and it's necessary to rebuild this capacity in a more conscious and deliberate way. Similarly, when excessive thinking destroys our capacity to live automatically, following established patterns without questioning, we're forced to rebuild our relationship with existence in a more conscious, more intentional, more authentic way. This process can be uncomfortable, but it can also result in a much richer and more satisfying way of living. One of the most surprising discoveries we make when we begin to think excessively about our existence is that many of the things we always considered personal problems, individual flaws, specific inadequacies, are actually universal existential questions that every conscious person faces at some point in life. The feeling of not knowing exactly what to do with your life, the difficulty of finding meaning in daily activities, the anguish before important choices, the fear of death, the need for love and recognition. All of this is part of the human condition in a much more universal way than we normally recognize. This understanding can be tremendously consoling for people who always felt as if they were the only ones facing these existential dilemmas. Camus reminds us that the absurd condition of human existence is not something we should try to overcome or resolve definitively. It's something we must learn to live with creatively and affirmatively. The absurd is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be embraced. When we stop fighting against the fundamentally meaningless nature of the universe and begin to create our own meanings within this condition, we discover a form of freedom that doesn't depend on external guarantees or absolute certainties. We discover that we can be happy, fulfilled, passionate about life, even knowing that this life doesn't have a predefined purpose, a guaranteed direction, a universally valid meaning. Excessive thinking also teaches us about the nature of existential courage. It's not the physical courage of facing external dangers, but the psychological and spiritual courage of facing uncertainty, ambiguity, the responsibility that comes with total freedom of self-creation. It takes courage to live without the guarantees that social conventions and cultural traditions usually offer. It takes courage to make choices based on your own carefully examined values, even when these choices are not understood or approved by others. It takes courage to be authentic in a world that often rewards conformity and punishes originality. The destruction of normalcy through excessive thinking can be seen as a kind of symbolic death followed by rebirth. The person you were when you simply followed established patterns without questioning dies. A new version of yourself is born, a more conscious, freer, more responsible, more authentic version. This process of death and rebirth doesn't happen just once in life. It can be a cycle that repeats whenever you reach a new level of consciousness about yourself and your existential situation. Each time you deeply question some aspect of your life that you previously accepted automatically, you go through a small death and a small rebirth. Post-normalcy life after excessive thinking has destroyed your capacity to live automatically, is not necessarily easier than previous life. In many aspects, it can be more challenging because it demands more consciousness, more responsibility, more courage. But it can also be incredibly richer, more interesting, more satisfying, because it's a life you're actively creating instead of simply passively inheriting. It's a life that expresses who you really are, not who others think you should be. It's a life that honors your passions, your values, your visions, your unique contributions to the world. Excessive thinking also confronts us with the question of authenticity in relationships. How do you relate to people who still live in unquestioned normalcy when you can no longer do that? How do you maintain meaningful connections with family and friends who may not understand or approve the changes that deep thinking has provoked in your life? These are complex questions that don't have simple or universal answers. Each person needs to find their own balance between being true to themselves and maintaining important bonds with people who may be in different places in their existential journey. One of the most liberating things that excessive thinking can teach us is that we don't need others' approval to live according to our own values and convictions. The desperate need to be accepted, understood, validated by others can be a prison that prevents us from exploring who we really are and what we really want from life. When you accept that not everyone will understand or approve your existential choices, when you stop trying to convince others that your way of living is correct, you free yourself to live according to internal criteria instead of external expectations. Excessive thinking reveals to us that much of what we call social problems, cultural conflicts, civilizational crises, originates in the collective refusal to face the fundamental existential questions that each individual needs to resolve for themselves. When people don't know themselves deeply, when they haven't examined their own values and motivations, when they live lives based on others' expectations instead of authentic choices, they tend to project their internal frustrations and confusions onto the external world. The path to a healthier and more harmonious society may pass through the individual courage of each person to face their own existential questions instead of trying to resolve them through manipulation or control of the external environment. Finally, it's important to recognize that excessive thinking, however uncomfortable it may initially be, is a sign of mental and spiritual vitality. It's an indication that you weren't content with superficial answers, that you didn't resign yourself to an automatic existence, that you kept alive your capacity to be surprised, question, grow. In a world that often rewards intellectual passivity and social conformity, thinking too much can be an act of healthy rebellion, an affirmation of your deepest humanity. Thus we arrive at a paradoxical but profoundly liberating understanding. Excessive thinking destroys our sense of normalcy, not to make us less human, but to make us more fully human. It forces us to face questions that normal life helps us avoid, but that are fundamental for an authentic and meaningful existence. It takes away the comfort of unquestioned certainties, but offers us in return the possibility of creating certainties based on our own carefully examined values and experiences. It temporarily separates us from society's mainstream, but offers us the opportunity to contribute to that society in a more conscious and original way. Thinking too much is not a pathology to be cured, but a capacity to be celebrated and cultivated. It's the price and privilege of a consciousness that refuses to sleep, of a freedom that insists on exercising itself, of a humanity that dares to question even its own foundations. In this destruction of normalcy, through excessive thinking, we don't lose our humanity, we find our most authentic and creative humanity.